Jesus accepts the lowly. And we'll see 2 or 3 times in the section that we'll study tonight where Jesus is admonishing his disciples to be humble. They themselves were sometimes somewhat prideful and worried about being great. And so he encourages them to humility. A couple of times he'll use children as an illustration of those who are humble and who are therefore worthy of the kingdom and accepting of him as the Son of God and God his Father. So a lot of this lesson will be looking at things that deal with the importance of humility, Jesus accepting the lowliest and having an affinity for them, and the need for his disciples to put away pride. So we hope you'll enjoy this study as we've said tonight. We'll begin by looking at Mark chapter 9 and verse 30. The text says, "They departed from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know it." In the last lesson, you might remember that Jesus had taken his disciples north to the region of Caesarea Philippi. He'd had a discussion with them there about who he is. He'd taken 3 of them up onto a high mountain in that area, maybe Mount Hermon, and he was transfigured before them. When they came down from the mountain, in that same vicinity, there was a man who had a son who was possessed and epileptic, and Jesus healed him. And so all of that happened north of Galilee in the area of Caesarea Philippi. So now what we've just read in verse 30 is they head back south and they go through the northern section of Galilee. Jesus, as we just read, doesn't want anybody to know that. And it says in verse 31 that he taught his disciples and said to them, "The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he is killed, he will rise the 3rd day." But they did not understand this saying and were afraid to ask him. So here again, Jesus is telling his disciples about his imminent, soon to happen, crucifixion and resurrection. He'll mention this again just a little bit later in this context. He mentioned it also one time earlier. He's really starting to bring this to their attention as his earthly ministry winds down and he thinks about heading down toward Jerusalem and finishing out the task that God had given him to do on earth. So the disciples, though, didn't understand what he meant, especially by the resurrection at this point. They didn't understand that, but they were afraid to ask him. Maybe in this we see an inkling of their pride already being manifested. As I said, in this section that we're studying, they have quite a bit of problem with their pride, and Jesus points that out, will encourage them to humility. But why is it that people are afraid to ask questions that need asking? Questions when they don't understand things? Well, often it is pride. I don't know that was the case here, but very likely. Somebody more knowledgeable than you says something and you want to pretend like you understand what they're saying, and that's usually out of pride. That temptation comes from pride. And perhaps it was so on this occasion that his disciples didn't want to ask him. They were afraid to ask him because of their pride. They didn't want to admit that they didn't know. It's always good to ask questions if we don't know. If we don't understand, especially when it comes to the will of God, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to investigate things that you don't know about, especially when it comes to understanding the will of God. So that leads us to this first situation in which he's going to have to rebuke them for pride. We'll pick up the reading in verse 33. He came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road?" They kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." Again, they didn't want to admit what they'd been arguing about, what they'd been disputing about while they came on the road down to Capernaum, because it was this very thing. It was something that was instigated by their pride, by the desire to be great. And they didn't want to admit that to the Lord, but it was in fact their problem. So the text says in verse 35 again, he says, "If you desire to be first, you must be last of all and the servant of all." He took a little child, and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Jesus is trying to teach them the nature of true greatness, and true greatness in the kingdom starts with humility. These disciples needed truly to understand that. Jesus would be crucified, raised, and ascend back to the Father not too long from, not too far ahead, in the future from this point. And he was going to leave the spreading of the gospel to these men. He needed them to be able to work together, to serve one another, to serve him. They needed to understand what greatness was all about. It wasn't about, exaltation and elevation. It's not about that today. It's about humility and service. And so he uses a child as an illustration. Like a child who would believe in him and accept him. They needed to believe in him and accept him. But what he's really getting at is those that are humble enough to receive children are humble enough to receive the Father and the Son. When a person thinks they're too great to care about children, they think they're too great. Jesus illustrates that here. He'll use a similar illustration again later in this context, and we'll talk more about that when we get there.